Welcome to Same Day, Different Century. I'm Zach. Today is June 25th. Before dawn on June 25th, 1950, the darkness along the 38th parallel came apart. Artillery opened up across roughly 150 miles of front. 90,000 North Korean soldiers began moving south. Behind the infantry came Soviet-built T-34 tanks, the same model that had torn through German lines on the Eastern Front just 5 years earlier. The soldiers of the Republic of Korea, South Korea, had no tanks. They had almost no weapons capable of stopping a T-34. The attack caught many units unprepared. Within 3 days, Seoul, the South Korean capital, a city of approximately 1.5 million people, sitting less than 40 miles from the border, would be in North Korean hands. And so began the Korean War, a conflict that would last 3 years, kill hundreds of thousands of soldiers, devastate the civilian population of an entire peninsula, and drag in the United States, China, and the Soviet Union. A war that technically never ended. To this day, there has been no peace treaty. The Korean War remains unfinished. This is the story of June 25th, 1950, and how a line on a map became one of the bloodiest frontiers of the 20th century. To understand why those tanks were rolling south that Sunday morning, you have to go back to August 1945. Japan had just surrendered, ending the Second World War. Korea, which Japan had colonized since 1910, was suddenly free, but the Allied powers hadn't made serious plans for what to do with it next. In a rushed late-night session in Washington, D.C., 2 U.S. Army officers, Colonel Dean Rusk and Colonel Charles Bonesteel, were handed a National Geographic map of Asia and told to propose a dividing line for the temporary military occupation of Korea. They had roughly 30 minutes. Looking at the map, they proposed the 38th parallel. It split the peninsula roughly in half, it kept Seoul in the American zone, and the Soviets accepted it. Temporary, that was the idea. A placeholder until a unified Korean government could be established. That never happened. By 1948, the temporary line had hardened into 2 separate states, each claiming to be the legitimate government of all Korea. In the north, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea was led by Kim Il-sung, a former guerrilla commander who had fought the Japanese in Manchuria and been elevated to power by Stalin. In the south, the Republic of Korea was led by Syngman Rhee, a Princeton-educated nationalist who had spent decades in American exile lobbying for Korean independence. Both men despised each other. Both wanted the same peninsula. And both were, in their own way, spoiling for a fight. In August 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb, years earlier than American intelligence had predicted. The U.S. nuclear monopoly was gone. Then, in October 1949, Mao Zedong proclaimed the People's Republic of China. The world's most populous nation had gone communist. Washington was rattled. And then, in January 1950, U.S. Secretary of State Dean Acheson gave a speech at the National Press Club. He described an American defensive perimeter in Asia, the line of countries the United States was committed to defending. The perimeter included Japan, it included the Philippines, but Korea was not explicitly on the list. Whether that omission was intentional, a miscalculation, or ultimately irrelevant to what happened next is something historians still debate. What isn't debated is this. Kim Il-sung had been pushing Stalin for permission to invade the South for more than a year, and in early 1950, Stalin said yes. Soviet archival documents opened after the Cold War ended confirmed the extent of that collaboration. Stalin's calculus had shifted. The Soviet nuclear test, the communist victory in China, and the apparent signals from American foreign policy had changed his risk assessment. He gave Kim the go-ahead with conditions. Secure Mao's approval and move fast. Present the world with a fait accompli before any meaningful response could be organized. Mao agreed to back the plan and promised to commit Chinese forces if the situation required it. The North Korean invasion force was not improvised. It was equipped with Soviet weapons, advised by Soviet officers, and reinforced by tens of thousands of ethnic Korean soldiers who had fought in the Chinese Civil War and been returned to Kim Il-sung by Mao. This was a prepared, deliberate military operation. On the other side of the border, South Korea had roughly 100,000 troops. Though many were poorly equipped and inadequately prepared for a large-scale invasion, The South Korean army fought hard, but they were overmatched from the outset. When news of the invasion reached Washington, it was the evening of Saturday, June 24th. President Harry Truman was home in Independence, Missouri. Secretary of State Dean Acheson called him, and Truman quickly flew back to Washington. The historical record shows that Truman's response was fast and firm, shaped by a framework he'd been carrying since the 1930s. The references he reached for were Manchuria in 1931, the Rhineland in 1936, the pattern of unchecked aggression that had led, step by step, to a world war. He believed that failing to respond to the North Korean invasion would send a clear signal to every Soviet-backed actor on the planet that aggression works, and he wasn't going to let that signal go out. The Soviet Union had been boycotting the UN Security Council since January 1950, protesting the fact that Taiwan, the Republic of China, still held China's permanent seat, rather than Mao's new government in Beijing. Because the Soviets weren't in the room, there was no Soviet veto. The Security Council passed a resolution condemning the North Korean invasion and calling on member states to come to South Korea's defense. For the first time in its brief history, the United Nations had authorized collective military action. 16 nations ultimately contributed combat troops. They fought under the UN flag, but the overwhelming majority of those forces and the command structure were American. Truman committed U.S. troops without a formal declaration of war from Congress, calling it a police action. The early months of the war were desperate and close to catastrophic. American and South Korean forces were driven back in a rolling retreat, all the way to a small defensive perimeter around the southeastern port city of Pusan. They were holding on by a thread. Then, in September 1950, General Douglas MacArthur launched a surprise amphibious assault at Incheon, a port near Seoul on Korea's west coast, a high-risk gamble that cut North Korean supply lines and reversed the war in a matter of days. UN forces drove north, past the 38th parallel, pushing toward the Yalu River, the border with China. And that's when China entered. In October 1950, hundreds of thousands of Chinese People's Volunteer Army soldiers crossed the Yalu River, at night, in the cold. They hit UN forces in brutal winter combat and drove them south again. The war that had nearly been won became a grinding stalemate, fought back and forth along terrain that looked, painfully, like the 38th parallel. An armistice, not a peace treaty, was signed on July 27, 1953. The guns stopped and the line held, almost exactly where it had been on the morning of June 25, 1950. Approximately 36,000 Americans were killed. South Korean military deaths numbered in the hundreds of thousands. North Korean and Chinese military casualties were also enormous. Estimates run into the hundreds of thousands on each side. And Korean civilian deaths, north and south, may have reached into the millions. The peninsula was devastated, physically and demographically, in ways that took generations to recover from, and in the north, arguably never did. In the United States, the Korean War slipped into a strange historical silence almost immediately. It came after the triumphant narrative of World War II and before the defining agony of Vietnam, and somehow got crushed between them. The Forgotten War became its unofficial label, which is a strange thing to call a conflict that nearly quadrupled the U.S. defense budget, locked in a permanent American military presence in East Asia that continues to this day, and established the template for intervention under UN authority that shaped the entire Cold War era. And it left behind a peninsula still divided at almost exactly the same line that two Army colonels sketched on a National Geographic map in 30 minutes in 1945. One Korea became one of the most prosperous and dynamic democracies in the world, a genuine economic miracle. The other became one of the most isolated, militarized, and repressive states on Earth. The contrast between them, visible from orbit, is one of the starkest images of the 20th century's consequences. It all started before sunrise on a Sunday morning, with artillery fire and Soviet tanks crossing a line drawn in the dark. Over 75 years later, that line is still there. That same day, different century. I'm Zach. We'll be back tomorrow with another date, another story. Thanks for listening.